Just to introduce Mary Wallace, Mary is a leading global authority in data science. She's been tagged as one of the top data scientists worldwide. She's also a social media influencer and a frequent blogger in the field. She holds the position of an analytics strategist and solution architect at IBM and has built analytics solutions such as IBM Watson Health. Mary will be touching on a key subject that is humanizing analytics and how to incorporate societal values into artificial intelligence. Welcome, Mary.
So, data is transforming the world, and as technologists and as data scientists, we play a critical role in shaping that transformation. That's a responsibility that we should all take very seriously, and it's a responsibility that presents both opportunity and it's exciting, but it's also a little bit scary. And in this presentation, I wanted to share with you my perspective on both sides of that line, both the opportunity and the excitement, but also some of the concerns that we all need to think about. I've spent about 15, nearly 20 years doing people analytics. And it's based on that work that I'm presenting my perspectives here. So let's start with, so 1 second, let me just get this. Sorry. So it's with that perspective. I want to start with, first of all, the positive side. So we all know this, it's a great time to be a data scientist. The reason I believe it's particularly a great time to be a data scientist is that, you know, when I started working in this area maybe 20 years ago, the data, we still had lots of data, but the data was inanimate, what I call inanimate data. It was data about businesses, about manufacturing, about logistics. Today, the data we have is about people. It's about us. It's about how we live. It's coming from social applications. It's coming from mobile applications. It will be coming from the Internet of Things. The growth in data, as technology becomes more embedded into our lives, everything we touch generates data. Everything we do generates data. And that is the most exciting opportunity for us as data scientists to really transform the world. All this data is also generating exciting new use cases, from cars that know where they need to be without us telling them and they can go drive themselves there, to fridges that know when we're running low on food and they know what food we're going to need for the week ahead and they can just order it for us, to healthcare systems where we have lifestyle and health applications that can monitor our health, know when something is wrong, and can proactively intervene, whether that's scheduling a doctor's appointment, recommending medication, or just telling you something about your lifestyle and helping you change how you live. So this is really exciting for all of us. The second thing that is absolutely critical, and I know everybody says diversity, but I think we have a need for diversity more so than any other industry. And the reason for this, in my opinion, is the following. 20 years ago, when we were doing our work, when we were analysing data, again, it was about automating processes, automating factories. Now, when we're analysing data, we're analysing people. We have fundamentally changed in society. We're changing how people think, we're changing how they live, and this has a massive responsibility. And the only way we can do this and create a world that we all want to live in and not some dystopian nightmare is if we have diversity. And we need 3 types of diversity to effectively do this. First of all, we need gender diversity. And we need to bring in women, and not just bring them in for their great mathematical and technology skills, but we need to value the other skills. We need to value empathy. We need to value team building, collaboration. We need to value those skills that women and mothers have historically always had, because we're growing a child. This whole infrastructure, this analytics infrastructure that's going to change everybody's lives, we need to bring the female perspective when we're building this. The second type of diversity we need is academic diversity. Because we're transforming society fundamentally, and we're transforming how people live, we need to work with our colleagues in the humanities. It's not enough that we as data scientists, that we as technologists shape this future. We need to be working with humanists. We need data scientists working side by side with social scientists. This is going to be absolutely critical. And the third type of diversity we need is ethnic and geographic diversity. thanks to the internet, when we build solutions, we're building for a global community. When I build an application in Ireland, this is an application that could be used by a child in Nepal or somebody in Lebanon. We're not building for our own communities anymore, we're building for the world. And in order to effectively do that, we need to be representative of that world. And that's going to be absolutely critical moving forward. So we want to build technology, we want to build analytics that does no harm, that makes the world better. And I fundamentally believe everybody wants to do that. We don't intentionally want to build systems that are going to do harm. But it's actually extremely difficult to do this. And one of the key reasons why this is so difficult is because it's really hard to predict how people are going to use what it is we're building. And in fact, anybody who's worked in this space any length of time, you're always shocked at how somebody wants to use the analysis that you generate. You build it for one use case, and all of a sudden somebody wants to use it for something else. And this can be really, really challenging. And I'm just going to use a very, very simple example of that, something which has been in the news and we've all been seeing a lot of recently, and that is social news feeds. I spent about 10 years ago started working on recommendation systems to build personalised feeds. And the reason we do this is for a very, very good reason. We had all this talk about information overload. And how can we distill down all the information that's out there and make sure people get the information they need when they need it? The challenge is that when you use historical information about what somebody's done to predict what they're going to want in the future, you end up have a risk of creating the filter bubble. And the filter bubble has been something that was predicted long, long time ago. But yet we still build these personalised systems. We just threw them into society and we've let them become an extremely divisive capability that we all know has created these small micro bubbles within society. Now, could we have done things differently? Could we have predicted that this would happen and could we have fixed the problem in advance? I don't know, but I question whether or not a more careful approach to rolling out some of these analytic systems could have helped alleviate some of the issues that we see today. Issues that social media is now trying to solve, but whether we can proactively solve them after the fact or not is a question. So what I would say is this is a really hard thing to do, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't really try to do this and keep this at the back of our mind. So what I'd like to do for the rest of the presentation is share with you some observations from my work over the last few years. The first observation is stating the obvious, but there is actually real value to analysing personal data. The reason I state this as the first observation is because it's not always clear where the value that an individual gets around analysis, how that can be valuable to the business. What we very often see is a tug of war. We see on one side, we see the corporate, the retailer is analysing data for one purpose, and then the consumer is the victim. Or we see the employer and the employee, or we see the government and the citizen. We need to try to remove this tug of war and try and create mutual value. So in this example, this was a reputation analysis system we built. In IBM, we wanted to explore the idea that we could be data-driven in terms of how people worked, in terms of recognising what people know, who are the experts, who are the people that need information. If we could understand how knowledge flows across an organisation, we could help people be more effective at consuming knowledge, at using knowledge and generating value from knowledge. So we built a reputation analysis system for all the IBMers. We started very slowly because, again, remember the do no harm. We wanted to be very slow, very methodical, very thoughtful. We started with a few hundred people, and by the end we had 40,000 IBMers using the system. And some of the things here is when we initially built it, again, we built it for IBMers. They were the only ones that got to see their own analysis. It was to help them understand what their reputation is. But what it turns out is when we did this analysis and we then started to correlate this against other data sets that we had, we discovered that people that were highly engaged were significantly more innovative than those that weren't. Which meant that what we were able to do with the system is identify people that have the potential to innovate, but maybe they're under-leveraged, they haven't been able to achieve that, so we help connect them to the right types of people. So we're able to build systems to increase innovation by understanding where the reputation and the knowledge resides within corporations. We were also able to discover a second thing which was really important for companies, which is that changes in engagement directly predict whether or not people are going to leave the company. So you could start to actually identify whether you have attrition risk, people at risk of leaving the company. And since skills are so hard to find, this is really important. And finally, we were able to recognize companies that have network brittleness. And what we mean by brittleness is that the lifeblood of companies is information and knowledge. The more effectively knowledge translates or disseminates through companies, the more effective they are. So companies that have very brittle networks where they don't have good connectivity, or they have connectivity that's highly dependent on a number of individuals, they're quite brittle. If those individuals leave, the network of knowledge collapses. So this is kind of stuff we were able to tell companies simply by being able to give employees a tool that they could use. The second observation is maybe stating the obvious, but people do not like being analysed. The response we got initially was like, big brother, you know, you're spying on us, what are you going to do with this data? You're going to use this to fire us. I mean, the reactions were really, really extreme. And they were right to be concerned, because who knows what's going to happen with your data. The good thing here is that the very first thing we did when we built our system is we said, this is a system built by employees for employees. They control the data, they control who sees it, management has no say in terms of whether or not they see the data. This was a grassroots movement within the company. And once the employees knew that their data was safe and their analysis was safe, they started to relax a little bit. Still took time, but the next thing we had to do is we really had to build on that trust. Because what we found is that only when people trust you are they going to want you to analyse their data. So we built trust over time. Privacy, protecting their data was critical. Being very transparent. So all the analysis we did, tell them what algorithms we are using, what data sources we are using, how we're interpreting those data sources. This is the number one challenge for you data scientists out there. How do you describe what you do in a way that somebody who doesn't understand data science knows? That's critical. If what you're doing is like black magic, nobody's going to trust you. So that was the key thing that we discovered. We had to build trust. And that came from transparency, it came from openness, it came from giving people control on their data. So that's another critical learning. And then the final one I want to talk about here is the economics of data. What we see frequently happening, and in Europe we're very, very focused on privacy. We have a lot of data protection, and we have a new data protection regulation that goes live in May of this year. So we care about privacy. What frequently happens is that people think that because data can be exploited, data is bad, and we shouldn't be collecting data. My argument is the opposite. The more data we collect, the better. But what we need to do is we need to have systems in place, we need to have controls in place that protect the integrity of the data and the individual. So putting control back into the hands of the individual. We see a number of initiatives I'm currently involved with blockchain, where we're looking at self-sovereign identity and various ways of putting people in control of their data. But data is good. The more data you have, the better. And the reason why this is really critical is as the world becomes more data-driven, the people who don't have the data will end up, like money, will end up being poor. They won't have access to services, or those services won't be as good as the people who do have data. So a very simple example, we have a colleague from LinkedIn that's going to be presenting later. But just imagine a world where in future your chances of getting a job are directly related to the strength of your network. People that have lots of intellectual capital but have lots of social capital will have an easier time getting a job. This means people that don't have data, people that don't have networks, people that don't have a footprint will end up being negatively impacted. In health, we have data-driven healthcare. People that can go to a healthcare provider and have a 20, 30, a lifelong longitudinal patient record that isn't just about their clinical data, but about their lifestyle, about their activity, about their food, all of a sudden those people will get better healthcare than the people that don't have data. And this is why, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the ID 2020 project, which is aiming to have every person on the planet to have a digital identity, anybody born after 2020, to have a digital identity so they can start collecting and managing and securing their own data for the future. So I think we need to think more about data. Data is our lifeblood as data scientists, and we need to protect the ecosystem, we need to protect the individuals, and we need to ensure that we have a solid data platform moving forward. So finally, the last comment is, technology is transforming our lives for the better, one would hope. It does have a huge potential from an analytics standpoint that we all should take advantage of. But it does present societal challenges that I would argue we should all think about carefully and ensure that we don't end up with this kind of tug of war between the analyzer and the analysee. Thank you.
We'll take questions from the audience. Okay.
Sorry, George Tuma from Global. You mentioned that analysts should well describe what AI, what data science is in an easy way for non-scientists. What is the definition?
The definition, that's very hard because it depends. One of the learnings that we had was that rather than just trying to describe the algorithm, which is extremely difficult to describe, and it probably doesn't make sense to somebody who's not a mathematician, what we did instead is we focused on describing the data. So for example, say when we're doing reputation analysis, we have an algorithm which looks at how people respond to the data you create. So it looks, for example, at whether somebody reads the information, the content you create, whether they share it, whether they comment on it. It looks to see whether the ideas that you've created, whether they've been disseminated through the network. So we would focus more when we explain it, we would focus on telling the individuals about what is happening with the data. So we're saying we're looking at your data, we're looking at the shares, we're looking at the reads, we're looking at the likes. So in that way it was easier for people to understand what we were doing. So instead of talking about the algorithm, we talked a little bit more about the data. And that was one way that we took. But there's no right or wrong answer here. It's a tricky thing to do.
Hi, very interesting presentation, thank you. I'm Samar from the Lebanese American University. Data now is considered a currency for many organizations. Do you think with the new Data Protection Act that's coming in effect in May, will we have challenges in collecting more data?
So yes, I do a little bit of work with some governments because I do think we have a challenge with respect to privacy versus control versus ethics. So we do have a challenge, and I don't know what the answer is right now. I do, as I said, we've been looking at things like blockchain, looking at ways that we can give people more control over their data. Consent is becoming increasingly a key thing, where individuals need to give consent for some data to be analysed. I do think we have the technology in place to do some of this. I do think there's some governmental challenges in terms of regulations around this. So we have a challenge ahead of us. I don't know what the answer is, but I do think if we don't solve it, we talk about the potential of all this data. If we can't use the data, we can't realise its potential. So I think there's a couple of things. I think one is we do need to be looking at consent, looking at ways that we can give people back control of their data. We'll need that for regulation. And the other thing we need to look at as well is how can we get the regulation to be more cognizant of the fact that data needs to be collected and ways that we can continue to do that in a way that protects the individual.
Hi, can you comment a bit more on cybersecurity and the use of data or misuse of data by governments for political ambitions or goals?
Yeah, I mean, So this is a hard one. I did a TED talk a few years ago talking about the future of data and people and privacy. And the problem is frequently in the case of governments, if governments exploit your data, they're the same organisations that create the legislation around the data. So we end up being in a kind of a tricky situation. I do think we've seen certain things around, say, the UN to try and create laws around what can or can't happen with data, but it's a little bit tricky. I guess I have a slightly different perspective. And I think we've seen this actually in the fake news movement, where we've seen some countries, particularly I think it was Finland or one of the Nordic countries, have created a really expansive education program for children to teach them about fake news. I guess I would argue that there's maybe an opportunity for a grassroots movement to educate children and people about data, about the strength of data, the weakness of data, the risks of data. Because if we can shine a light on this and take away the black magic, then citizens can demand control, can demand greater rights around their data. So like the UN, you've got the right to the number of rights. We should have the right to data. Why shouldn't that be a right, specifically in a data-driven world? So I think there's a lot. I think there's a combination of a top-down, the government legislation, and I think there's a bottom-up that we as citizens we need to demand rights, and that I'm hoping that both of these things will happen moving forward.
We have a question from PSU. So if we are in the field of data science, who would take the ownership of data in relation to the economics of data?
So data ownership is another wonderful, tricky one. There is different people have different answers. So I'm going to give you my perspective, which is not necessarily the gospel. Personal data about the individual, fundamentally should always be owned by the individual. It's theirs. They can license it to a company, so when they use LinkedIn, they're giving LinkedIn permission to use their data, or they're giving a healthcare organisation permission to use their data. But the second they decide they do not want to give access to that data anymore, they should have the right. That's my personal belief. Then I think you have data that's generated, which does belong to companies. So the way it normally tends to break down is that data that's personally identifiable belongs to the individual. And data that's aggregated or de-identified. So for example, I'm sorry to pick on LinkedIn, but if you're analysing, for example, a social network, or we do this in our company, and if you generate some new data from that, which is not identified, that generally belongs to the company. And that's the same in the research space as well, we often find that. So I think there's no simple answer. In terms of the economics of data, it's the same thing. The person who owns the data, the individual, should get the economic benefit of their data, and then the corporations obviously get the economic benefit from their data. But there's no hard and fast answer at this stage.
I guess my question is, do you know of any organizations, entity in the technology field who are exactly working on this or focused on the data governance and the data privacy in that space?
So I think everybody is actually at the moment. I think one of the key things, especially big companies, there's a huge focus right now on data governance and on privacy, on consent is being a really, because I guess in Europe we've got GDPR that's been really driving massive regulation in this space, and also then you have the likes of healthcare, so you have HIPAA and various healthcare regulations that drive this, and also the financial services space. So I think every company right now is really focused on this because it's a risk. If you're analysing data, there's a risk. If you're not, I do think there's a big startup ecosystem around blockchain and identity, which for me I think is one of the most exciting initiatives. I think blockchain has some really interesting characteristics that could make privacy and data and consent easier to manage. And there's a lot of startups actually doing work around blockchain. So.
Hello, thank you for your comment. Sally Kautharani from Ribai Group, Ribai Analytics Group, sorry. Hello. I'm Sally Kautharani from Ribai Analytics Group. You said that data science seeks to understand how knowledge flows, and in other sides, social science is important to let us analyze people, behavior, and how do they think. But I would like to know your vision about epistemology science. So where you find it is in this cross science. Epistemology did let us to understand how knowledge works. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So when we did the work on, say, reputation analysis, that was a perfect example of a project where we couldn't do this as a purely data science effort, for a few different reasons. One is that in data science we often have the bootstrapping problem. In order to do analysis you need lots of data, so you want to bootstrap. And in our case, there had been decades of research done by the humanities field, in social science, in behavioral psychology. There'd been a whole 20 years of research done into how communities interact, how reputation is developed, so all the behavioural science. So what we basically did when we started the project is we actually codified some of the behavioural science and the social science insights. And then we translated that into the solution that we built. And then we used a combination of data science techniques and algorithms in order to enhance that work. So in our case, it was really it was kind of easy to some extent because there was lots of research into the whole area of behavioural analysis. What we needed to do is we needed to translate that work that had been done before digital networks were created. They were done about social networks in general. And we had to translate that into the data science. So for example, we had to look at what are the digital signals that translates to reputation and map those to the behavioural models. So that was an example where we combined both of them at the very early stages of the project. When we started the project, we designed the project around the humanities work that had already been done. And then the data science complemented it. But I think you don't always have the maturity. So sometimes what it is a case of that if you're building an analysis, so I look at news feeds as an example. So when you're building these personalized news feeds, I think the interesting thing is to look at to work with social scientists to explore what's the feedback loop that happens when you start to constrict the information that you show individuals. What does that do? So there's the whole social studies around how these networks affect people. And I don't think we do enough of that, to be honest with you.
Thank you, Mary.